Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Well, before I start, thanks for all sitting through everything. I mean, this is the last talk of the day. As many people have said, and as you heard time and time again, the era of remote sensing, cheap ground-based sensors, and web service access is here. There's a data deluge, it's a data earthquake, it's a data tsunami, it's a data flood. But very often, turning that data into science requires extra information that we've started talking about as ancillary data. You've got to actually curate that ancillary data along with the other data in order to actually get the science out. So this talk this afternoon is with my colleague Deb Agarwal at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, talking about our experience with the Flexnet community. Flexnet, it's a network of networks. We were very fortunate to get kind of by chance connected with them. It's 467 towers you can see across the United States. Most of them are actually in the Ameriflex collaboration in the United States or in the Carbo Europe collaboration in Europe. However, there's Vanuatu in the Pacific, as well as CocoFlux, OzFlux, and many other collaborators. 967 site years from 253 towers. These towers are various different shapes, ranging from the 397-meter tower in Minnesota to smaller installations of sensors in croplands. Each tower is measuring about 20 different measurements, raw measurements, solar radiation, precipitation, temperature, and 20 derived variables. The science is really all about understanding the interactions between micrometeorology and plants. One of the scientists we work with calls it the earth breathing. In addition, there are 145 ancillary variables. So one of the things I want you to do is 40, 145, 40, 145. This total data is about 800 million numbers right now. It's half-hourly data cut down from 10 hertz data, but it's L4. The original data set was assembled and processed in early 2007. The previous data set was about 20 times smaller. This is also a living data set. We're expecting a data release, data update, that's good. And we have 75 paper teams with over 200 scientists. So it's actually one of the larger environmental collaborations. What's environmental sensor data? Well, you all know this, right? It's time series data over some period of time at some location. You may actually end up with raw data, the actual voltages that you have to then compute into a science variable like soil temperature. You may be getting a more processed data. And L4, like we deal with, is gap field quality assessed. It's about as good as it gets. One thing that's absolutely true with environmental data is recalibrations, gaps, and errors are a way of life. It's not like putting a sensor in the data center. Okay? One of the best pieces of mail I've ever read on the reflector was the mail about vultures. Okay? Birds may poop, but vultures chew. Okay? Today, environmental sensor data is somewhere in the gigabytes to terabytes, depending on where you are in the processing. Another thing to notice, of course, is time is not another access. Environmental remote sensing data, much emerging happening. Here, we've been working this summer, as you heard earlier this morning, with Jai on the MODIS satellite. That's an example of MODIS, our reprojection showing surface temperature. The black spots there are clouds. One of the things we see happening is making virtual sensors. Our colleagues at Oak Ridge generate virtual sensors out of the MODIS data by simply picking the right pixel. What's environmental ancillary data? Well, it's pretty much everything else. Okay? One of the common things I show on this slide is a garbage pail, because that's often what it is. These three slides are from webcams. That's phenology data showing you the early spring, mid-spring, green up phenology. You get fires, sediment, leaf area at work, tree rings. It's a grab bag. Okay? couple of learnings or observations along the way. We thought latitude and longitude were constants for a site. Silly us, what were we thinking? Sometimes sites move a little bit, sometimes because of typos and other things, you just don't get it right in the first place. Intermittent measurements. People go out to the field, people make observations. Citizen science is an important emerging factor here, right? There's a lot of debate about whether or not you can use citizen science, but on the other hand, groups like the National Phenology Network who go out and actually watch for bud break may be the only way you get coverage, okay? The distinction that I'm going to draw through this talk is I'm not talking about metadata. I'm not talking about units. I'm not talking about what instrument you do. That's different. We handle that differently, but it's not as critical to the science people are trying to do. And by the way, this stuff is teeny, right? You've been hearing about petabytes. I'm here to talk to you about kilobytes. Ancillary data is really different. First of all, it's very hard won, okay? You don't put out a sensor and just wait. You go out and you dig a pit. You go out and you wade into something. You go out and you shoot an air rifle, grab the branch, and take it back to the lab. You pay for lab fees, right? Or somebody spends time in a lab. The other thing that happens is very often it's gleaned from the literature and then gets passed around. It is very small. The Flexnet collection that we're dealing with right now is about 30,000 numbers. Okay? So it fits on an Excel spreadsheet, but that's a bad idea, and I hope by the end of the talk you're convinced of that. Ancillary data is used very differently. Sometimes it's used as a constant, sometimes it generates a time series, sometimes it's used as a time filter, right? Time since fire. It's really important if you're interested in understanding the biosphere and photosynthesis to know that a fire went through last year or went through 100 years ago, because that tells you the age of the tree. Okay? You also see spatial aggregations in models. So, you know, the usage pattern is arguably as diverse as the data. The other thing I want to point out is that it often requires scientific judgment. I'm showing one of the Chinese sites here on the coast. And we've seen land surface classification for that site as either a wetland or a grassland. And it all depends on who you ask. So what is curating ancillary data? Well, you've got to define a reporting protocol. You've got to define what you want taken, how you want it taken, how you want it reported. There has to be a mechanism for submitting it, right? Once I've been out to the field, I've dug my pit, I've made my measurements, you want me to transmit that to you in a CSV file or in a web form or some mechanism other than, you know, by the way, I have this measurement. There are emerging archives. Oak Ridge is one archive. We are now, these days, frankly, an archive. So coming from the submission into the archive, constantly cleaning. Okay? I spent a lot of my life working on this project being kind of the laundress. And lastly, outputting data products for scientists to use. But, you know, let's face it, I could draw the same picture for sensor data. I could draw the same picture for remote sensor data. So how hard can this be? I mean, it's 30,000 numbers. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we started in early 2007 at the Latouille conference. And the original Latouille collection was harmonized by two people who had a ginormous spreadsheet with 76 columns and 458 rows. And cells were cut and pasted and cut and pasted and cut and pasted. And the first observation I want to make is with a spreadsheet that big, the odds on you getting the right cell when you cut and paste at all times aren't good. Okay? They're just not good. And figuring out that you did something wrong is even harder. Okay? This is low-tech problems. Low-tech problems. The other thing that happened was, if you kind of look through this spreadsheet, the columns right there are all latitude and longitude. Two of the folks spent about 2 months sorting through the sites, trying to figure out where they were. Because latitude and longitude gets reported in different datums. It's very easy to do the plus and minuses digital. You're all laughing, going, yeah, how hard can it be? Well, then there's the problem in this particular case of my particular favorite, Zotino. It's in Russia. kind of the middle of kind of Russia there. And we now know today that there are 5 sites, and they are located in a cluster. It took us about, Deb, how long was it, 9 months to finally get mail from one of the investors who says, I've been there. There are 5 sites. Here's where they are. Ping, 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 right? This site shut down here, this site shut down there. But it took us a while to find the guy. And before then, some people thought there were 2. Sometimes we thought there were 3. And because they're so close, right, there's kind of, one is in a bog and one is in the pine forest, right? So they have, to first approximation, the same lat long. You can no longer use lat long as a distinguish. So some part of this, again, is capturing that knowledge, capturing that piece of mail where the guy says, I've been there, I know. Right? Don't pay attention to the website that says there's 4 sites. There are 5. Okay. When we pulled apart the spreadsheet and started looking at it, one of the big first learnings was there was a sort of a reporting protocol. I'm going to give you an example of the vegetation type, which is coverage. Now, in theory, what this should be, because that was the preferred question to the investigators, was an IGP classification. There are a dozen classifications: grassland, cropland, woody savanna, forest, deciduous forest, mixed forest. You get the idea. The first 3 examples there are examples of what were actually in the spreadsheet. Okay? The good guy, grassland. The guy that really wanted to tell you everything he could possibly imagine. And the guy that just didn't follow directions. Okay? Same thing with canopy height. Canopy height is how high the trees are. Okay? You might think that that's a number. Well, no, it's not really. Okay? So initially, when we simply thought about curating this stuff, I thought canopy height, it's a number, right? I'm golden. The first thing we learned was you absolutely have to treat all of this as text. You can cast as numbers, you can extract as numbers, but you better count on it always coming in as text. Another little observation, boy, I don't think it's on this slide. Europeans use commas. Okay. Oh, and yeah, here's the other bad thing about spreadsheets. The original spreadsheet was passed around at this conference. I personally collected 4 variants. How do I know they were variants? Well, I chewed them all up and compared them. There's no way, looking at a spreadsheet that's that big, to know whether it's a variant. Right? So out of that experience, we worked together with a collection of scientists to do the so-called BATM reporting protocol, Biological Ancillary Disturbance and Metadata, BATM. Developed after the experience, very much more prescriptive about what to report, for disturbances in particular, right? An enumerated control vocabulary. It's a wildfire, it's a harvest, it's a insect infestation. And specific qualifiers. If it's a wildfire, was it high, medium, or low? Dates. Is the date approximate? Right? And very carefully work through each one of these variables. It's a lot harder than it sounds because, in fact, the science here, again, is very dispersed. The people that worked in forests knew what they wanted to have reported, but they didn't necessarily know what was the right thing to do for crops. Savanna sites are somewhere in between. Okay? We specified units. We specified 2 reporting mechanisms, either a spreadsheet or at fluxdata.org we put up a web farm. And very carefully on every single solitary one put a free-form comment, because one of the things we learned about this community is they love telling you their story. Sometimes the comments are referenced, sometimes the comments a long diatribe, sometimes the comments empty. Now, in the past, and in working with a number of other environmental scientists, we've seen a lot of sort of other ways of slightly improving. That is to say, it's better than a spreadsheet. I'm going to call it the access approach. And what it really is you are entering a maze of twisty little tables, because what happens is that the table structure is driven by the scientist's conception of the data. So, for example, I kind of made up a little example here. Soil composition would have the sand percentage, the rock percentage, but the biomass table would be different, right? And then the disturbance table would be different, and the phenology table would be different. And by the way, a soil sample is different than a biomass sample in terms of the metadata and everything else. So the little kind of eye chart up there, that little kind of color thing, that's an actual real-life NRCS data. That's your government at work. The little kind of reddish tables are where the data are. Okay. The yellow tables are derived. That is to say, I'm relatively sure. So, for example, an average measurement is computed outside the database, but then sequestered inside. The blue seems to be kind of computed in one way I don't understand. You know, it's all over the map. Okay. So, one of the problems there is that very rarely, when you see one of these, do you have any source provenance. You may know that it came from the United States GS, but where did they get it? When did they get it? When was it last changed? Right? Very rarely added. What else? Yeah, it sounds so simple, but it's clearly one of these things that grows and grows and grows, and before you know it, you've got soup. So what do? Well, we went the database guy way. We normalized everything. But in order to normalize everything, we basically had to think about every data value as having some number of parameters. And the parameters are datum type specific, right? So the parameters for disturbance are different from the parameters from biomass, or different from the parameters from a soil sample. We also baked in the notion of a folder, right, for provenance. So we surface data releases. Again, not necessarily rocket science, but brand new to this community. Being able to surface a latest release, being able to surface, frankly, we're holding some data that we don't surface now. So we know it's there, but we distinctly don't allow access. That's proved to be very, very handy, right? Additionally, we did kind of what I think of as poor man's provenance. Submit date, submit group, that is to say the template, the website, where do we get it? And we keep every template. Submit email, comment associated with the submission, our comment associated with the first look of the data, the date we last process it, because we do process templates more than once, and a retire date. That's turned out to be one of those things that we didn't design in, but it's one of those things that has saved us many times. Knowing that a value has been corrected is great. Knowing who corrected it and when. When you get the mail from one of our fine colleagues that says, "You have the wrong number. You must have screwed it up." And we respond, "Well, you know, actually, we got it from one of your students." Okay? In order to pull that off, this is one of those things where if I was a real computer scientist, I would use the word ontology, but let's face it, I'm not really this isn't good enough to be an ontology. There's an enormous data translation table. Okay? So for the various submission mechanisms of row text, the variable classification, and then does it have parameters? If so, what? So we basically take every single column in any spreadsheet, have a row in this table, do the conversion, right? This also means that we can have multiple user-facing names for the same quantity. That's critical in this field, because depending on whether you're a biologist or a soil scientist, you will use different words for the same thing. Okay? It took us forever to work some of this out. Anything else? Oh, one of the things that's actually turned out to be really handy is we push out the documentation out of the same table. And that's saved us, because from time to time I know I forget what AG biomass CT is, but by having it right in the table, I can simply refer to it. Okay? And lastly, a very simple control vocabulary. That part of the database, honestly, I would hope that as we get a richer and richer semantic, we would be able to replace that with Sparkle or other infrastructure. So what does the archive operations look like? Well, first thing we do with any submission is we shred it. We pull it all apart. Okay? One cell, one row. The next thing we do is we fold it using that decode table. So I pull all the parameters apart, and we fold them all back together. For those of you who look at copies of the slides, that's a pumpkin. If you have kids, trust me, it's a great pattern. Then when we're all done folding, we clean. Well, actually, we clean before, we clean after. Did I say we clean a lot? And push out a number of data products. We've been pushing out, how many different ones, Deb? I've lost track. And we group the parameters, right? I mean, you think about it from a scientist point of view. I just want the disturbances. I don't really care about anything else. So just give me a report with the disturbances. No, I really want the foliage. Give me that. We've also pushed out a number that really just do the informatics. Who reports what? Okay. For example, the upper kind of, it looks like an eye chart, but it's kind of fun. What you're looking at is the first cluster of sites, because this, I think it's about a 4-page report. So this is about a quarter of the sites, and various variable groupings going across. Color-coded as to where we got them, whether we got them from the PI proper or whether we got them from that harmonized initial set. One of the things you can see is there certainly are some sites that are a little bit laggard in terms of getting any sort of information out. They have lat long, they have the classification for the veg type, but that's really all. Other sites have been much, much more forthcoming. While it is nominally, quote, quote, part of your responsibility as a tower owner to submit this information, we've seen in the Ameriflux about a third of the sites submitting data. Okay? Very hard one, very hard to get out of the investigator. Another thing that having everything in a database lets us do is it lets us do these kind of eye charts. I do part of my cleaning with a glass of wine in my hand. I simply plot it up, and what you see here is one of the variables. This is a logarithmic plot. So this particular variable should have a range of no more than an order of magnitude. What's going on here is a units conversion. We have some in one units and some in the other. Okay? Being able to spot this gives us a fast way of starting it. I don't pretend to be a soil scientist. I don't really, above ground biomass, what is that? But a plot like this can tell me I have a problem. Lastly, we were talking about some of the reports. We've been putting out two, a per site report and the specific cross-site reports. The per site report went out to the National Carbon Program. Being able to view the data set as a whole, being able to view the data set in a data type agnostic way has just proved to be unbelievably handy. So we were talking about template submissions. 44 of the 120 sites have submitted templates. If you kind of look at this, the template creation date, that is to say the date that they put on the spreadsheet before they sent it to us, kind of plots. The first time we process it, sometimes the lag is because they hold on to it for months. Sometimes it's because we've been trying to get into a regular processing cycle, so it's the two things together. Last processing date, at this point in time, we've processed every template at least twice, some of the templates 3 times, because sometimes it takes 3 times for them to get it right. It's been kind of interesting. One of the things, though, you see is this is not just a sort of nice slope, but this is very, very bumpy. And what's going on here is specific events, right? If you're a tower owner and you're sitting on top of this data, this is work to fill out the template. You got to go talk to this guy, and you got to talk to this guy, and you actually have to compute it, and you have to check where did I leave that. That happens best when someone says, if you send me this, I'll use your site in my paper. So the 2 campaigns that we've seen, the first, the NACP campaign, that was National Carbon Program. In order to be in the analysis, in the synthesis analysis, you had to submit some BATM data. Anybody that didn't submit BATM data fell off, okay? And we got a wonderful cluster of submissions. The other times that you see bumps, particularly the early bumps, Some of these investigators own more than one site. So for example, our collaborator Bev Law in Oregon owns 5 sites. We got 5 templates all at once. Okay. So what have we learned? Well, one thing is that we thought that this was one collaboration, right? One group of scientists who were sharing data and working together. And frankly, we've noticed that there's a lot of differences. And some of the differences are country to country, some of which are collaboration to collaboration. We love working with the Canadians. The templates we get from them are beautiful. The follow-up we get from them is beautiful. I have exactly one guy I know that coordinates because everybody feeds it to him and then he feeds it to me. It's beautiful. Wonderful. I love the Canadians. They won't share with anybody. That's the data set that we're holding tight. They will share with NACP, but they won't share with anybody else. But they're very coordinated. They never color outside the lines. Americans love coloring outside the lines, right? There is something about Americans where I'm going to just embed it says don't embed comments in your Excel spreadsheet. They do. It says only send us one. They don't. There's something about it. One of our very, very close colleagues has sent us, let's just say it's his own format, and sort of said, well, here it is. And we sort of said, well, how would you map this to the reporting program? Oh, gee, don't know. So, yeah, it's very, very interesting. The notion is, I think, and Deb captured it really well. The third bullet is hers there. They're providing data access, but they're not publishing their data. And yet, if you want to have a data product that is useful for someone else, you really do have to publish. You have to think about it. That portional normalization is absolute goodness. The approach we've taken with the database has more than paid for itself. Being able to build a data cube so I can run those informatics very fast. Yes, a data cube is really overkill technology for 30,000 numbers, but boy, it's handy to have to go late night browsing around in Excel. A particular learning that we were surprised at, that they very often think that template is their repository of numbers. Right? They want to give that same template to us every year with just updates because it's the only place they have where their own data is one place. Even the fact that we're cleaning and giving them one back, they still want to hold on to that original. So we inevitably have that, well, so is that a correction or did you typo? Kind of question every time we process a template. We had set up a process where, particularly on the web form, any submission goes through a science curator, not us, right? But someone who is knowledgeable in the science. What we've noticed is that very often what we're getting there is a rubber stamp. Oh yeah, check. We were surprised. We figured that, we'd put a number in front of them, they'd look at it and they would say, yeah, that looks right. No, that doesn't look right. We're seeing more and more of a, yeah, I'll okay everything. Which of course is defeating the process, right? We were looking to the science curator as being the one that would protect us against our own naivete, right? I can do the dumb check that says if I have a submission with sand, silt, and clay percentages that I shouldn't have more than 100. That's easy. But, any particular break point or something like that associated with a site, I can't really do any sanity check about that. The above ground biomass, I can get in the order of magnitude, but not much further. So that's been, that's been a surprise. And yet, right, the guys that are using this, the minute there's a bad data point, they get all upset, right? So somehow or another, there's this notion that I don't have to really work to publish my data, but I'm going to expect that any data that I use is perfect. And I find that just amazing with this stuff. They don't, that same approach and thinking is not in the sensors. There's a notion that the sensor could have had some other problem, blah, blah, blah. It's not the same. There's a conceptual barrier there in the scientists. And lastly, I think the campaigns, boy, those are absolutely the way to go. Right? Forget about asking people, particularly Americans, to fill out templates. Tell them that we're collecting data specifically for this analysis, and you will be listed. Oh, yeah, I'm right on that one. So where are we going? Well, we're working with a lot of other folks, right? Instead of working with one group, what we're trying to do is make technology that can be shared and generalized and reused in a number of different collaborations. So there's two other collaborations kind of going on right now. One is with the National Marine Fisheries folks. They get volunteers in sort of citizen science, give them an hour or two training, I think it is, and then they walk up a creek and they take notes about the nature of the creek, riffles, pools, runs, and they do fish counts and they take little grab samples. So it's a little bit higher quality data than citizen data, but not much. But absolutely key data for making the policy decision on salmon operations in California, and that's fundamental kind of your tax money at work as well as futures. Secondly, we've started engaging with the National Soil Carbon folks. It's kind of a map of soil carbon in the United States. That's actually produced as a result of some field data run through a large model, and they're trying to get ready to do a much better simulation job. That data will also go into NACP, into the model synthesis work. Frankly, one of the things that I've been looking at is that whole access question. I'm ending up seeing more and more and more and more. Everybody access is dangerous, okay? It's a good news, bad news. The good news is the data is at least out of Excel. The bad news is it's in Access. And I'm in that twisty passage of tiny little tables. So finding a technology that can simply map. So a scientist could say, oh yeah, this column is that variable, right? Rather than having to have computer science involved is a goal. And there's some things coming down the pipe there from Microsoft Research that look promising. So with that, that's kind of all I have to say. I'll leave all the...
We have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
I drive a Jeep Wrangler and butterfly swamps. How do you collect data from them? Because most of the time we don't make it across.
I don't know. I stay out of the field for the most part. I just hear the results.
What sort of data do you normally collect in terms of, you collect what sort of time cycle?
It all depends on the nature of the scientist that's actually interested, okay? For this collaboration, the ancillary data really looks like the following sorts of data. Let me give you the list off the top of my head. One is the soil pit data. So digging a pit, looking at soil carbon, looking at soil fraction and soil bulk density. They do biomass estimates by, literally taking crops or taking some sample of foliage before and after, usually in the various layers of the canopy. There is foliage carbon, foliage nitrogen, so foliage chemicals. You grab a bunch of leaves and you run them through. Disturbances, right, keeping track of that. There's tree rings that they take so you can see the accumulated growth. There's root biomass, stump biomass, because if you've had a fire, there aren't any trees, you really want to know what's left, okay? So it's really all over the map. The HAB8 people are taking altogether different data, right? They're really classifying streams as they go, looking at whether the stream is shaded or it's not. They usually got the hobo little sampler for occasional water temperature. So this stuff is just, it's all over the map. The phonology folks go out and look at the tree and record the date. Is it budding? Is it leafing? Is it, okay?
And do you collect from the same location every time, or do you try to multiply so that you get...
Depends on which group. Depends on which group. For the Flexnet folks, they're supposed to be taking it the same location because they're taking the sensor data too, right? For the phonology folks, for the HAB8 folks, more or less they do the same, but but we haven't been over here, so maybe we ought to go, right? So again, this is not according to the scientific method. Any other questions? Well, thanks for sticking it out very much.